On April 30th, 2026, Donald Trump signed a presidential permit in the Oval Office. He was approving a new oil pipeline, 650 miles through Montana and Wyoming, 550,000 barrels of Canadian oil per day, flowing south into American refineries down to the Gulf Coast. He called it a great deal for America. His supporters called it a masterstroke. The construction companies called it a contract. The financial press called it the revival of the most controversial pipeline in North American history. 24 hours later, Mark Carney held a press conference in Ottawa. He announced that a competing Canadian pipeline, one that goes not south into the United States but west to the Pacific Ocean and directly into Asian markets, was now, in his own words, more likely than not. Two pipelines, two countries, two completely opposite directions, and a 24-hour gap between the two announcements that tells you everything you need to know about how this trade war is actually being fought. This isn't a story about pipes in the ground. This is a story about leverage, about who controls Canadian oil, about whether the United States maintains its grip on the most strategically important energy corridor in the Western Hemisphere, or loses it permanently to Asia. And as of today, both pipelines are racing toward the same deadline. Let's start with Trump's pipeline, because without understanding it, the Canadian response makes no sense. The project is officially called the Bridger Pipeline Expansion. It has been nicknamed Keystone Light by the financial press, a reference to the Keystone XL pipeline, the massive Canada to Gulf Coast project that has had one of the most turbulent histories in energy infrastructure. Here's what Trump actually signed: a presidential permit authorizing Bridger Pipeline LLC to proceed with the border crossing component of its infrastructure. The permit allows development work to begin. The pipeline itself is 3 feet wide, 650 miles long. It runs from the Canadian border through Montana and Wyoming, where it connects with the original Keystone pipeline, which already runs to Gulf Coast refineries in Texas. At peak volume, it would carry 550,000 barrels of Canadian oil per day into the U.S. system. That's 2/3 the capacity of the original Keystone XL, the pipeline Biden killed in 2021. The same pipeline that Trump had approved in his first term, that Biden revoked on literally his first day in office, that the Canadian company TC Energy spent years fighting to revive. TC Energy eventually lost its legal bid to recover $15 billion from the U.S. government for the cancellation. That case ended in 2024 with TC Energy receiving nothing. Now Trump is back, and he's revived the concept under a different name through a different company with a slightly smaller pipe. The permit still needs additional state and federal environmental approvals before construction can start. Company officials expect construction to begin in 2027, first oil by late 2028 or early 2029, assuming no legal challenges from environmentalists who have already signaled they intend to fight it. To understand the strategic play here, you have to understand what this pipeline means for the United States. Canada exports roughly 4.1 million barrels of oil per day. Alberta alone produced that volume in 2025, a new record, up 4.2% from 2024. And here is the number that has driven Canadian energy policy for 2 decades, the number that has defined the entire geopolitical relationship between these two countries: 95%. 95% of all Canadian oil exports go to the United States, not to Asia, not to Europe, not to anywhere else. To the United States, to American refineries, into American gas tanks. This is the structural dependency that Trump has been leveraging throughout the trade war. You want to impose counter tariffs? Great, but 95% of your oil goes to us. Your producers, your workers, your provincial governments, all of them dependent on continued U.S. access. The Bridger pipeline, from Trump's strategic perspective, deepens that dependency. More pipeline capacity flowing south means more Canadian production locked into the American market, more producers with more contracts pointed toward U.S. refineries, more infrastructure that would be financially devastating to abandon. It's not just an energy project, it's a chain. That's why, when Carney responded 24 hours later, he wasn't just talking about a pipeline. He was talking about breaking the chain. May 1st, 2026, one day after Trump's signing ceremony, in an interview with the Canadian press, his first major sit-down interview since becoming Prime Minister more than a year earlier, Carney was asked directly about the Bridger approval and what it meant for Canada's energy future. His answer was 3 words that moved markets. He said a new Canadian pipeline, one heading west to the Pacific, not south to the United States, was more likely than not. In a separate interview published by La Presse, he went slightly further. He called it more probable than possible, and he linked it directly to what he called the bigger package: the strategic economic repositioning of Canada in the post-tariff world. What Carney was announcing was not a surprise to anyone who had been tracking Canadian energy policy. The groundwork had been laid months earlier. On November 27, 2025, Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith had signed a landmark Memorandum of Understanding, a historic agreement between Ottawa and Alberta that cleared the path for exactly this kind of project. The MOU explicitly declared an Indigenous co-owned Alberta oil pipeline to Asian markets as a project of national interest. On October 1, 2025, Alberta had already announced itself as the formal proponent for the West Coast Pipeline, meaning the provincial government was taking the lead on shepherding the project through the approval process, an unusual arrangement that was designed specifically to accelerate the timeline. On January 6, 2026, a technical advisory group had been formed, including 3 of the most experienced pipeline operators in North America: South Bow Corporation, Enbridge, and Trans Mountain. The group began preliminary assessment work immediately. By April 22, 2026, 8 days before Trump's signing ceremony, Bloomberg was already reporting that Alberta was examining 3 specific northern routes for the pipeline, with a target capacity of 1 million barrels per day. Trump signed his pipeline on April 30th. Carney confirmed his on May 1st. But the real timeline shows that Carney's pipeline had been in motion for 6 months before Trump made his move. Now here is the detail that most coverage has completely missed. Trump's Bridger Pipeline, 550,000 barrels per day. Canada's Northwest Coast Pipeline, 1 million barrels per day. Carney is not building a smaller version of what Trump approved. He is building something almost twice as large, pointed in the opposite direction. 1 million barrels per day to the Pacific, to Japan, to South Korea, to China, to India. The 4 countries that Bloomberg, Alberta's government, and multiple energy analysts have specifically identified as the primary markets for this project. Demand for oil and gas will remain strong in Asia for decades. That is not a political statement. It is a demographic and industrial reality. Japan and South Korea are energy import-dependent industrial economies that need stable, secure supply sources. China is the world's largest oil importer. India is the world's fastest-growing major economy with the world's fastest-growing energy demand. Canada has the 4th largest proven oil reserves on the planet, the 4th largest oil producer in the world. And currently, despite that position, 95% of its oil exports go to one customer, a customer that is actively using that dependency as a trade weapon. The Northwest Coast Pipeline, if built to its target capacity, doesn't just reduce that dependency. It transforms the equation. 1 million barrels per day heading to Asian buyers at Asian market prices under long-term Asian contracts fundamentally alters the bargaining position of every future Canadian government in every future negotiation with every future American administration. This is why Carney called it more than an energy project. The official Alberta government website uses the phrase pathway to generational prosperity. That language is not accidental. They are describing a structural shift in Canada's position in the global economy. While the Northwest Coast project is the headline, the full pipeline story is more complex and more immediately consequential. Canada currently has 1 pipeline shipping Alberta crude to the Pacific coast for export. It is called Trans Mountain. It is owned by the Canadian federal government. It became a crown corporation when Ottawa bought it to ensure it got built. The existing Trans Mountain expansion project was completed and began operating in 2024. It has already increased westbound Canadian crude capacity significantly, and the Trans Mountain Corporation is now moving to boost oil flows by an additional 10%, seeking approval from the Canada Energy Regulator to use drag-reducing agents, a technology that allows higher throughput through the same pipe diameter without new construction. In parallel, Enbridge, the largest pipeline company in North America, has already approved expansions for its Mainline and Flanagan South pipelines that will add 150,000 barrels per day of additional capacity to the U.S. market by 2027, with a second phase potentially adding 250,000 more by 2028. These are U.S.-bound expansions. They are happening simultaneously with the Asian project. Canada is not choosing one direction or the other. It is expanding in both directions at once. This is the full picture. Not a single binary choice between the U.S. and Asia. An active diversification strategy that increases total export capacity while reducing the percentage going to any single customer. The Northwest Coast Pipeline is not a done deal, and anyone who tells you it is hasn't looked at the map. The route goes through British Columbia, specifically through the northwest coast of British Columbia, some of the most ecologically sensitive and politically complex terrain in Canada. Coastal First Nations have raised significant concerns about tanker traffic in their territorial waters. The BC government under Premier David Eby has not fully committed to supporting the project, and environmental groups have signaled opposition. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's preference is a route to the north coast of British Columbia, a different path than what some federal and provincial planners prefer. The technical advisory group is currently evaluating 3 different northern routes, none of which has been selected yet. The formal application is due to the Federal Major Projects Office on or before July 1, 2026. That date matters for a reason we've discussed before. July 1, 2026 is also the USMCA deadline, the day the 3 North American trade partners must decide on the future of the agreement. 2 of Canada's most consequential decisions in a generation, converging on the same date. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre has criticized Carney for what he called wasting an entire year on a pipeline that still has no confirmed route, no construction company attached, and no approved environmental assessment. That criticism has some validity. The project is real, but the distance between a signed MOU and shovels in the ground is measured in years, not months. What Carney would argue, and what the official Alberta government materials reflect, is that speed is being built into the design from the start. The Building Canada Act provides a streamlined approval process. Indigenous co-ownership, baked into the project structure from day one, is designed to address the consent challenges that killed previous pipeline projects. The July 1st submission deadline is not symbolic. It is the trigger for the formal designation of the pipeline as a project of national interest, a legal status that changes the regulatory framework entirely. There is one more piece of this that most analysts have not fully connected. Last month, in April of 2026, Mark Carney traveled to Beijing. He signed what was described as a strategic energy and trade cooperation agreement with China. The announcement said explicitly that it hailed a new era in Canadian-Chinese bilateral relations. This is not an accident of timing. This is sequence. Step 1, sign an MOU with Alberta declaring an Asian pipeline a national priority. Step 2, sign a $7 billion agriculture deal with China to establish trade infrastructure. Step 3, visit Beijing personally and sign a strategic energy cooperation agreement. Step 4, approve the Bridger pipeline, the U.S. route, 1 day before confirming the Asian route, so nobody can accuse Canada of unilaterally turning away from the United States. Step 5, announce that the Asian pipeline is more likely than not and submit the formal application by July 1st. Each step is connected to the next. Each step builds the infrastructure, political, diplomatic, financial, physical, for the same outcome. An Alberta oil industry that can choose its customer rather than accept the terms of its only customer. Previous estimates for a similar pipeline project showed potential annual government revenues of $3.8 billion across Canada and 800,000 jobs over the lifetime of the project. Those numbers are from projections on a comparable project scale. The actual Northwest Coast pipeline could generate more given the 1 million barrel per day capacity target. The U.S. Commerce Secretary, speaking at Davos in January, said globalization had been incredibly harmful to the United States. He was arguing for less global integration. Canada, having watched that argument used as a weapon against it for 14 months, is responding in the most direct way possible. Not with ideology, with infrastructure. 2 pipelines. 2 directions, 24 hours apart. Trump's pipeline at 550,000 barrels per day points south, toward American refineries, toward American leverage, toward a continued relationship of dependency that the current American administration has shown it is willing to weaponize. Carney's pipeline at 1 million barrels per day points west, toward the Pacific, toward Japan, South Korea, China, and India, toward customers who have never imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, toward a future in which the 95% figure, the one that has defined Canada's energy vulnerability for 2 decades, stops being 95%. The 2 announcements, made 24 hours apart, were not a coincidence. They were a statement. We will trade with you. We will supply your refineries. We will sign your permits. And while we do all of that, we will also build the alternative. The formal application for the Northwest Coast Pipeline goes to the Federal Major Projects Office by July 1st. The USMCA renewal deadline is also July 1st. These 2 deadlines, arriving on the same day, will define the shape of North American energy and trade for the next generation. In real estate, the phrase is location, location, location. In energy geopolitics, the phrase is direction, direction, direction. And for the first time in Canadian history, Canada is choosing its own. If you want to follow what happens on July 1st, both the USMCA vote and the pipeline submission, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Real numbers, real infrastructure, real consequences. Thanks for watching.